Hello and welcome to Oddtober, a series in which we're reviewing all of the main series Oddworld games in one long marathon. This time, we're taking a look at the third game released in the series, Oddworld Munch's Oddysee, and this game actually marked quite a substantial departure from the rest of the series in a lot of ways. So, let's pop it in and take a look. First of all, before we get into the game itself, let's talk a little about Munch's Oddysee's development history. The last game in the series, Abe's Exodus, was released in late 1998, and at that point the PS1 era of consoles was coming to an end. Wanting to be a step ahead, Oddworld Inhabitants began developing its next game for the new generation of consoles and left the PS1 behind. Of course, it would make sense for them to move over to the PS2, with them already having an established fanbase on the PS1. And this is exactly how development initially started. However, they were struggling to get the game working on the PS2, having a lack of understanding of the new hardware, which made it difficult to program the game efficiently. Lorne Lanning, the director of the Oddworld games and co-founder of Oddworld Inhabitants, decided to move development of the game over to the original Xbox, which had superior graphical capabilities and was generally more powerful, allowing them to have more characters on screen and better animations too. Because the Xbox was designed to have the same architecture as a PC, the development team had more experience working in this environment, so it made sense from every possible point of view from a production standpoint. It wasn't all about the production aspect that this decision was made though. From a business point of view, the hand was forced into this decision. Oddworld's publisher from the previous two games, GT Interactive, was being purchased by Infogrames, and under this new company, all budgets for games in development were being cut drastically, only giving them $3 million to work with, while they were projecting costs to be as high as $10 million. So they made the decision to ask Microsoft to co-publish the game with Infogrames, giving them a higher budget to work with, but also meaning that the game had to be an Xbox exclusive. There was a lot of issues with this game's development, with the Oddworld Inhabitants team being the exact same people that worked on Abe's Oddysee and Exodus. They had little to no experience with making 3D games. The last part of the game's development was apparently a total mess, and it wasn't going to make its deadlines. So they hired outside programmers who by all accounts practically rewrote the code for the entire game in a matter of 9 months. Plus, Microsoft was interfering with the creative vision of the Oddworld team, making the game more light-hearted in an effort to make the game more mainstream and therefore make more money. The version of the game that I'm taking a look at though isn't this original Xbox version, and rather I'm taking a look at what you would consider to be the more definitive experience with the game, the remaster that was released on PS3 in 2012. It's simply titled Oddworld Munch's Oddysee HD, and was actually developed by a small studio called Just Add Water, rather than Oddworld Inhabitants. Oddworld Inhabitants was acting as the game's publisher though, which they were able to do thanks to digital storefronts like Steam, PSN and Xbox Live becoming more mainstream. Exactly how Oddworld Inhabitants were able to do this despite signing an agreement with Microsoft for the game to be an Xbox exclusive, I have no idea, and there doesn't seem to be much information about this situation either. Oddworld Inhabitants left the game industry after creating the fourth game in the series in 2005. So maybe at this point all contracts became invalidated? Or maybe the agreement had an expiry date? Or maybe the contract was abandoned on Microsoft's side after the game didn't receive the acclaim it expected. Then with the fourth game Oddworld Inhabitants developed, there's also the fact that EA got involved. But that's not a story for now. I have no idea. It's a confusing mess though, and as you would expect, it resulted in a game that's incredibly underwhelming at best, and flat out terrible at worst. Either way though, in the present day, Oddworld Inhabitants are an independent studio that own all the rights to all of the past games, despite having Infogrames, Microsoft and EA previously publishing them. I don't know how they pulled that off, but kudos to them for doing it. That was a lot of background detail, but I wanted to go through all of that just to show what a complete and utter train wreck this game's development was. It's no surprise then that the game itself isn't very good. And while Oddworld Inhabitants are obviously partially to blame for that, with them being the developers, I do feel like publisher interference and the general state of the game industry at the time really didn't help either. I mean, I kind of feel sorry for them having to go through all of that just to get the game released. Now we can finally talk about the actual game. It opens with an Oddworld Inhabitants ident which uses the same eerie sound effects as Abe's Oddysee, which actually works quite well and sets the tone for the game. What I will say though is that the quality of this cutscene and the others featured in the game is a bit, well, rubbish. It looks heavily compressed and seems like it's been stretched to look like it's widescreen too. This is probably just the result of bad porting done by Just Add Water though, but still, this is supposed to be the definitive version of the game. The game's menu is extremely reminiscent of other Oddworld games, but something about it just feels a lot cheaper. Munch doesn't climb up and open a flap and greet us, and instead we just cut to the menu with him already there. The GameSpeak menu only has Abe and Munch for us to look at, rather than Abe, Sligs, Scrabs, Paramites, and Gluckons, which were all featured in the Abe's Exodus GameSpeak menu. What is a nice touch though is that you can access a cutscene viewer and an artwork viewer from the main menu, something which I criticised Abe's Exodus for not having. We have the option of viewing a backstory before starting the game, and this basically is just a re-edited version of the cutscenes from the previous games, showing everything that happened in Abe's Oddysee and Exodus. The thing is with this though, is that Abe's Exodus did this backstory thing, but rather than just being a re-edit of the first game's cutscenes, it had a new voiceover and told the story in a very sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek way. It had a ton of charm, and when you compare that to Munch's Odyssee's backstory, which by the way is stretched to widescreen and just looks weird, as well as not having any charm, it's just disappointing.
But if you was halfway decent about it, and tried your best to save Abe's buddies, the end would have been much better for Abe. And if you'd like to see it, you should dish out some cash and go buy this stinking game.
The game opens with a cutscene showing Munch, a Gabbit, looking for other Gabbits to befriend. However, after a long period of searching, he discovers that no Gabbits are left and is on his own. One day he finally hears a Gabbit singing in the distance and investigates, only to be led into a trap laid by the Vikers. These new villains eventually come to collect Munch from the trap and take him to Vikers Labs, a facility where the Vikers experiment on the creatures of Oddworld to create new pharmaceutical products to sell. Munch is needed for his lungs, because apparently Gabbit lungs make a good transplant for Gluckons, and the Gluckon Queen, Lady Margaret, is in desperate need of them. One of the Vikers wants to use Munch in the meantime though, to go and collect other critters that have fallen into traps. And to make him do this, the Vikers implanted an antenna into his head, which will lead him to the traps. Little do they know though that this antenna allows Munch to send out a small bolt of electricity from his head, and he uses this new ability to free some nearby Fuzzles. The Fuzzles being a new inhabitant to the series, which are basically furry little balls that have sharp teeth. The newly freed Fuzzles then free Munch from his confines. Meanwhile, Abe, it turns out, is being told this whole story by a new character called the Almighty Raisin, who basically says that Abe and Munch's fates are connected, and Abe needs to go and help to free Munch before it's too late. The game then begins, and we're playing as Abe in the Almighty Raisin's cave. The story is just completely all over the place. On one hand, there's aspects of it that are really good, but then on the other hand, there's aspects of it that are outright terrible. One thing the game does do well though is introduce us to the new main character to the series, Munch, and I think what helps with this is the amazing voice acting done for the character, which really helps to hit home all of the character traits.
My name is Munch, and I've been singing for him ever since.
I don't like the music that kicks in when Munch is trapped though. I think it's jarring, and this scene could have been extremely creepy and dark if it wasn't for that. Then when we're shown Vika's labs, the tone is just completely off, with these horrible looking new villains basically being made into a joke instantly with these childish jokes and slapstick comedy elements that just fall flat.
Humphrey! What are you doing? Shh! Be nice. You're spoiling my concentration. Now hold still, damn it!
Oh, I can't believe it! You're not working on our new and improved fabric softener!
I honestly think that had this game been darker and not just completely all over the place like this, it could have been really impactful. It could have made a statement about animal abuse in scientific studies and abuse in pharmaceutical experiments. Not to mention the extinction of the gabbits, which reflects our own world making animals become extinct by changing their environment and hunting them all the time. But that doesn't really happen because it's just instantly a light-hearted joke. Then we have our introduction to Abe, and he's kinda just there. Nothing happens to introduce him organically, we just cut, and oh, there he is. And who, in God's green earth, is this big raisin bastard? He's literally never been mentioned in a previous Oddworld game, and now he's just there, and we're supposed to accept that a Raisin Man is giving Abe his mission now. It's jarring and inconsistent, and I hate it. But anyway, let's finally get into the gameplay, which, it turns out, is just as disappointing as everything else we've seen so far. Firstly, why the hell do we start the game playing as Abe, despite having that long introduction to Munch as a character? This is Munch's Oddysee, not the continuing adventures of Abe. We should have started the game as Munch and met up with Abe later on as like a surprise or something. But that's the least of our problems. Throughout the game, so many different issues present themselves. So let's run through a massive list of everything wrong with the game and why it's so awful to go through. So firstly, the game is way too dark. And I don't mean dark in tone, I mean it's literally so dark that you sometimes can't even see where you're going. It's really bad. Then there's all of these goddamn tutorial pop-ups that happen all the time and tell you pointless information, like if you follow the collectibles, they might lead you somewhere. And it's like, yeah, thanks mate, I've played a video game before. Or alternatively, they might give you information that you've literally already been told, which is always a nice waste of time. The audio balancing is just so bad. You can never hear dialogue properly over the ridiculously loud sound effects and ambience, and there's no audio balancing options besides making the sound effects or music softer, which does practically nothing, or outright turning them off. There's no subtitles either, so you're just screwed on that front.
Hey, you saved the village! But to protect the Madakans here and help the Lulu Fund, you've gotta get into Splinters!
Then there's the horrible camera, which is slow and inverted on the Y-axis, but not on the X-axis, making it awkward throughout the whole game, and of course, you can't customize this in the menu either. The controls are horrible too. Movement is done with the left analog stick, and it's way too sensitive, making it difficult to walk in a straight line, something you should be able to do without even thinking about it. The animations are awful. I swear that there's no frames of animation between standing still and going into a jump, and it just makes the game look so poorly produced. There's pretty much no music in the entire game, and even when there is, it's boring. There's atmospheric music, and then there's boring droning like this. Also, when you're next to machinery or any other environmental objects that would obviously emit a noise, there's just nothing, which breaks immersion in the game instantly. And then there's other sound effects, like Abe itching himself, that are ridiculously loud for no reason. I mean, no reason other than the fact that they're probably trying to hide how goddamn silent the game is.
You may notice that if one of your friends passes on, you can bring them back to life by giving spoos to this resurrection totem.
There's now multiple loading screens you have to go through to enter new levels, which wouldn't be a problem, but Abe's Oddysee and Exodus literally didn't have visible loading screens apart from when you first launched the game. There's also this stupid issue where one design for a loading screen appears, and then it cuts to a completely different design. Almost like they changed the loading screens but layered the new one on top of the old one, instead of just deleting the old one. Abe now needs to collect these spoosh shrubs to be able to chant and possess enemies, which contradicts the previous games where he could do this at will, and just comes across like the developers didn't know how to make the chanting not overpowered with good level design, and instead just put this boring and contradictory mechanic in instead. Talking about being contradictory, why can Abe now jump 50 foot into the air and do flips? He's supposed to be the equivalent of a normal human, underpowered and unable to perform actions that a human can't, in terms of movement. Then we also have a health meter now, which of course means Abe can take a completely unrealistic amount of hits before dying, again contradicting the previous games. We now also have HUD elements popping up all the time. Every single time we hold one of the GameSpeak buttons down, we see this menu appear to remind us of what buttons to press, which is just annoying and kinda treats us like we're idiots and can't remember it for ourselves. But on top of that, the GameSpeak functions are remapped to different positions to what they were in the first two games, which is frustrating, and there's not even as many GameSpeak functions as there were before either, with there being 8 functions in Abe's Oddysee and Exodus, and only 6 in Munch's Oddysee. Every single enemy in the game is functionally identical to the last two. Basically, they either spot you and run at you to kill you with melee, or they shoot at you from a distance. So remember how Paramites only attacked if there were 2 or more of them? Or how Scrabs always prioritise fighting each other over killing you? Or how Sligs can control Slogs with GameSpeak, and how Gluckons can control Sligs. Basically everything that made the world's inhabitants stand out and feel like real creatures. All of that is now completely gone. See this herd of Paramites? They are now identical to this herd of Scrabs, which shouldn't even be attacking us according to the lore established in the first games. Oh, and remember how Abe's Exodus added in the Madokan emotions? That's just completely gone in this game too. It's terrible. Like, honestly, it's upsettingly bad, and it's like the game is just taking a massive crap on everything the previous games established. Okay, let's calm down for a minute. Yes, the game does do a lot wrong, but now with the game being in 3D, they had to have some good ideas for new gameplay mechanics, right? One of the main gimmicks of the game is that after Abe meets up with Munch, you can swap between the two characters at any time, and both of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. Abe is a lot more agile and can talk to Madokans, whereas Munch can swim and talk to Fuzzles. Munch is also able to interact with some types of machinery too, whereas Abe can possess organic enemies. The issue with this is that Munch's abilities are a lot more context sensitive, which results in you playing the whole thing as Abe and only swapping to Munch when it's absolutely essential to do so. The game doesn't even make it all too frequent that you're forced into using Munch either. Which just begs the question, why in a game called Munch's Oddysee is Munch the completely inferior and least fun character to play as? It's completely backwards. His movement speed is far too slow, he can't jump, he can't talk to Madokans, and there's a lot of Madokans in this game. He can't lift anything, and he can't easily beat enemies by possessing them. He's rubbish, and it shouldn't have been like that. I mentioned earlier that Munch can control machinery, but really there are only 2 things he can control. A crane and a machine called the Snoozer, which is used, I think, twice in the entire game. The crane is used to pick things up and drop them, obviously. And this is actually used in one clever bit where you need to pick up Abe to get him to an unreachable Madokan, and this is probably the best puzzle in the entire game. But then it's repeated a million times, and gets old fast, and ruins it. Most of the time though, you'll be picking up bombs with the crane and dropping them on enemies that take far too long to kill, which is just boring. Or towards the end of the game, you'll be picking up Madokan eggs and putting them into these portals to rescue them. And of course, because the game has to ruin literally everything, you don't just put one batch of eggs into the portal, but about 20 million of them need to go in. You think you've seen padding in a game before? Look how long this egg rescuing process takes. The snoozer is basically just the same as when Abe possesses a slig, only instead of killing enemies like a slig would, it just puts them to sleep and they eventually wake up. So what's the point? Speaking of Abe's possession, I've already mentioned that Abe now needs to collect spruce shrubs to be able to chant. So the way that this works is that the more spruce you've collected, the longer you can chant for, and the longer you chant, the more spruce you'll use. But the length your chant can travel will be extended too. So basically the reason the developers must have done this is to stop you from being able to chant and navigate your possession aura across the entire level, which would have been overpowered. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is an okay mechanic and it gives you a reason to actually collect stuff, but it's a bit of a boring workaround in my opinion. You can now possess pretty much everything you come across, from sligs, paramites, scrabs, gluckons, the new slig variant called Big Bro Sligs, and vikers. The thing is though, because all of the enemies are functionally identical, either being a melee attacker or a ranged attacker, there's not really any element of tactics that plays into the possession system beyond just going for whatever the enemy is that does the most damage. So even though Munch's Oddysee has by far the most possessible enemies, it just feels very lackluster when compared to Abe's Exodus or even Abe's Oddysee. Also, because everyone has tons of health in this game now for some reason, the sligs and all of the other creatures you possess feel extremely weak. It takes forever to kill anything, even if you're a slig with a machine gun, which ruins the experience of taking over a slig in the original games and having a temporary power trip. Even the species-specific GameSpeak has been removed. Well, I say removed, the GameSpeak is actually still there, but it's never used in the entire game to communicate with anything, so it might as well be removed. The most it's used for is about 2 examples where you have to possess a slig and talk into a microphone to unlock a door. But you don't even need to say anything specific or remember a pattern like you did with the slig locks in the older games. You can literally just say anything and the door opens. They've just dumbed the game down so much and it seems absolutely insane to me. Despite GameSpeak not being used by the enemy characters, it is in fact used by Abe and Munch throughout the game. However, because the level design is so basic and uninspired, this literally will just boil down to saying hello, wait, and every now and then sending your friends into the battlefield to attack. Yeah, that's right, in this game Madokans aren't completely defenseless and can actually attack enemies if you tell them to. In certain levels, the native Madokans can even be armed with clubs and bow weapons to make them into actual warriors. I find this a bit weird to be honest, and maybe if it had been built up a bit in the story rather than kinda just being sprung on us, it might have worked. But it's just so jarring going from the old games where the Madokans were weak and peaceful, to them all of a sudden being able to mow down battalions of sligs with laser crossbows. I feel like this is an example of where maybe Munch could have been more of a feature, because Munch is capable of communicating with fuzzles, and with these being new creatures to the Oddworld universe, it makes sense for them to be capable of fighting. So why didn't they make it so Madokans are useless in combat, but fuzzles are the fighters? It would have given us another reason to play as Munch, because as it stands, he's just not worth playing as. Another thing that annoys me about this game is how the Madokans are wearing silly outfits to represent their type. So natives will be wearing wooden crowns and tribal garb, and the slave Madokans, called scrubs in this game, are wearing these silly jail outfits. And it's just yet another aspect of the game that feels inconsistent and too light-hearted and jokey. I just think that corporate interference really messed with this game's tone, and it's all over the place. Putting all of this stuff to the side though, one of the worst things about the entire game is just how repetitive and boring it is. Every level is structured pretty simply. You have to get to the end of the level while rescuing as many Fuzzles and Madokans as possible. But where the game falls down is in the fact that there's almost no variety going from level to level. It's just a matter of clearing out the enemies, either by gathering a big group of Madokans and sending them in to attack, or by possessing an enemy and killing everyone that way. Then you move the Madokans to the rescue portal, which is sometimes tedious because the game forces you to pick up the Madokans and carry them one by one to the end of the level, because of dangerous obstacles. But in these situations, why did they put so many goddamn Madokans there? They literally do this all the time, and every time they do it, there's always like 8 or more Madokans, and it's boring and feels like busy work. There's a real lack of sense of urgency or danger in the game too, and for a while I was trying to work out exactly why that was. I think the lack of music or any real atmosphere presented through the game's visuals is partially to blame for this, but a design flaw that also adds to this is that if Abe or Munch dies, you can just bring them back to life using this egg item and not lose any progress. So basically, as long as you keep one character near one of these eggs, you're invincible. Which is a far cry from how powerless you felt in the original games, where you died from any single enemy attack. If it's not clear by now, I am so disappointed by this game, it's unreal. Everything that the previous games in the series had been building up to and working towards has been thrown out of the window by this game. And what makes me feel sad about this is that it's obvious that it isn't entirely Oddworld Inhabitants' fault. Still, when you take a step back and look at the game for what it is, it doesn't achieve anywhere near the same level of quality that you would expect from an Oddworld title. Still though, maybe the story of the game is still pretty good if we put all of that to the side. Well, the thing is, there really isn't too much of a story going on here, and there's almost no character development to even talk about. Basically, after the start of the game, Abe goes to rescue Munch, but Munch meanwhile escapes Viker's labs on his own, and the two literally bump into each other. One of the worst scenes in the entire game is this moment where Munch and Abe meet for the first time, and literally no dialogue is exchanged between them. Nothing at all is said, and then the gameplay starts up and you say hello to Munch, and Abe refers to him as his buddy instantly without even knowing who he is or having seen him before.
Hello, Abe. There's my buddy.
Munch doesn't even know anything about Abe, so why are they suddenly pals going on an adventure together? I feel like it could have been a really cool journey if Abe and Munch didn't get along at first, and maybe had different morals and different agendas, but by the end they became friends and helped each other for a greater purpose. But as it actually is, the relationship is never explained or built up. It's such a shame. Anyway, Abe and Munch eventually get back to the almighty Raisin, who tells them that Abe needs to rescue Madokan eggs from Viker's labs, and Munch needs to rescue the last can of Gabiar, aka Gabbit eggs, that are also stored in Viker's labs. To do this, they'll need to infiltrate the facility incognito by using a lowly Glukkon called Lulu and making them ultra rich by draining the wallets of other Glukkons running facilities in the area, therefore being able to possess Lulu and purchase the Gabiar while also breaking into Viker's labs and rescuing the Madokan eggs at the same time. Wait a minute though, didn't Abe and Munch literally just return from Viker's labs, and they didn't need a Glukkon to get in there, so they just went from the starting area of the game to the end, only to go back to the starting area to be told to go back to the end again. It literally makes no sense. Ignoring that glaring plot hole though, the basic gist of what we're doing here is actually quite interesting, using the Glukkon's beloved capitalist structure against them by making them give the fortunes to another Glukkon, thus shutting down lots of Glukkon facilities along the way by making them bankrupt. Practically the entire game is spent just going to different Glukkon facilities and possessing lots of different Glukkons. None of them have any build-up, which makes them forgettable characters, if you can even call them characters. And even the environments you go through all look the same, and yet again have no build-up, basically making them lifeless open native areas where you travel from one facility to the next, or the facilities themselves, which are dark, boring and dull metallic industrial areas. There's no attempt at visual variety here, and I doubt you'd be able to tell one location from another, which again is so disappointing because of how drastically different the locations were in Abe's Oddysee and Exodus. Eventually you make Lulu mega rich and is invited to the Gabiar auction at Viker's Labs, so Abe and Munch sneak aboard his airship, because airships are apparently now a thing, which I find a bit weird considering trains seem to be the height of technology in Abe's Exodus, and break into Viker's Labs, rescue the Madokan eggs and possess Lulu and spend his entire fortune on the last can of Gabiar. Abe and Munch reflect on the futures, and Munch suddenly tells Abe that the Fuzzles are gonna blow up Viker's Labs. We then cut to a bomb in Viker's Labs, and it blows up, taking down the facility and revealing a moon with Munch's footprint on it, hinting at a greater purpose for him. Yeah, the ending sequence for the game is really disjointed and seemingly rushed. In one scene there's literally no dialogue and it comes across as really janky, but then we have this scene where they're just going for this really weird tone with the music. Plus, the whole thing with the Fuzzles planting a bomb and blowing Viker's Labs up comes out of nowhere and just seems like a lazy excuse to get rid of the facility without really working it into the story. Basically, the story of the game isn't very good, and that isn't very good for the game when there isn't that much story to begin with. You know, thinking back on it, this game was really an awful experience, and I don't think I would play it ever again. I'm giving Oddworld Munch's Oddysee a 2 out of 10. Every element that makes up a video game, the story, the gameplay, the controls, the camera and the sound design, is heavily flawed. There's almost nothing enjoyable about this game. It's boring, tedious, filled with busywork by escorting Madokans one by one over and over again, and by having these stupidly long crane sections. It looks terrible, even though I'm playing the HD version, being way too dark in some areas, and when it's not too dark, it just looks empty and lifeless. The 2 playable characters aren't implemented in a meaningful way and don't get the character development they deserved. The game's subtext and subplots are introduced and then ignored. Like, the whole animal experimentation thing and the threat of extinction is introduced and then never expanded on. And the fact Munch has a device implanted in his skull never really seems to faze him. And there's the whole thing going on with the Glucken Queen needing a lung transplant that we never learn anything more about, beyond it just being mentioned every now and then. I mean, we never even see the Glucken Queen, and come to think of it, in the 100% ending of Abe's Exodus, it said we were going to learn about Abe's mother, and that's not even ever mentioned either. The constant barrage of tutorial pop-ups, loading screens, HUD elements, health bars, and spoosh shrub collectibles make this feel way too video gamey. Which I know is an odd criticism for a video game, but Abe's Oddysee and Exodus was so good because there were cinematic experiences that didn't have any of that stuff. You could get so immersed in the game's world because it didn't follow video game conventions like that. Munch's Oddysee is just such a huge step backwards for the series on every level, and it's painful to go through. I honestly think Oddworld Inhabitants should have gone back to the drawing board when they realised they were in over their heads with this project. Maybe created a smaller game that was similar in length to Abe's Oddysee, and maybe even made it another 2D game to cut down costs. Still, it's easy to say all of this and criticise it in this way with hindsight. At the time, they obviously thought they knew what they were doing. The reason I've given Munch's Oddysee a 2 out of 10 and not a flat out 1 is because I do admit the new character designs are pretty good. The Vikers as an actual design look really sinister and evil, and Munch looks cute while also being disgusting at the same time. The fuzzles are maybe a bit uninspired and the big bro sligs look very odd in my opinion, but still, I really like Munch despite him not having a lot of development. I do also like the newspapers that appear after each level, which change headlines depending on what you did. Like here, loads of Madokans were murdered by a herd of scrabs, and the post-level newspaper reflected this. However, these newspapers seem to be replacing what could have been actual cutscenes, which is frustrating. The newspapers could have been placed in the actual levels, and it would have been a really cool attention to detail aspect. I think this is a game that could really benefit from a remake, but almost to the point where it's unrecognisable as the same game. Take Munch and take the idea of this horrible facility that does experiments on wild creatures to create new pharmaceutical products and just for the sake of torture too, and build an entirely new game around that. Maybe even make it 2D like the previous games in the series, and you might be onto something there. Maybe eventually that'll happen. We are getting this style of remake with Abe's Exodus in the form of Oddworld Soulstorm, which comes out in 2020. So maybe elements of Munch's Oddysee will be implemented into that, or maybe they plan on reintroducing us to Munch after that game. Who knows? So where did Oddworld go from here? Well, I actually think they made the right decision in moving the story away from Abe and Munch and instead focusing on a brand new character in a brand new location, effectively wiping the slate clean in an effort to prove that they still know how to make a good game. Still though, with this change of character and location, came a change in gameplay. So, join me next time when we're going to be taking a look at Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. I'll see you next time.